Welcome to the 8th video in our series using 2.5-inch strips of fabric left over from other projects or jelly rolls. Today's pattern is called Let's Dance. There's a link in the description below to the pattern, but I've got some great tips and tricks for you in this video. As long as you have strips that are already cut, you can start off right away with the sewing. Use a scant 1/4-inch seam allowance. I have a small bin filled with pastel fabric, which is going to be perfect for a baby quilt that I need to make. I'm using all the pinks, purples, yellows, greens, and blues. I'm going to use this entire bin of fabric. I need to end up with strip sets that have 3 different fabrics in them. These are all 2.5-inch strips, so it'll be 3 2.5-inch strips sewn together. So as I sew sets of 2 strips together, I set aside a 3rd strip about the same length in a pile close to the machine so that I make sure I have enough strips to add the 3rd strip to each strip set. Make sure that for every 2 strips you sew together, you set aside a 3rd strip for adding on later. I am not pressing these strips before I sew them together. I will press them though, just not yet. Do not fear, the strip sets will lay flat. I could spend a couple of hours pressing each of the strips before I sew them together, but I'm going to save myself some time and press 2 strips at once after they've been sewn together. It's your choice when you want to press, so you do whatever you're most comfortable with. When sewing the strips together, I didn't really pay too much attention to the fabrics that I was sewing together. I just tried not to do too many that were 2 pinks sewn together or 2 purples sewn together. I tried to mix up the fabrics, the colors, and the type of design in them. The idea is not to overthink it too much. Just pick up 2 fabrics and sew them together. Once you've sewn through about 2/3 of your strips, you should have another 1/3 in a pile for when you need to add the 3rd piece onto your strip set. You can head to the ironing board. You can press the seams to one side or open, it's your preference. For myself, first I'm going to press the strips flat, then I'm going to open it up and press to one side. Some of the strips have creases in them from being bindings, and I will use Mary Ellen's Best Press spray to help flatten them out. Once everything is pressed, head back to the machine to add the 3rd strip to the strip set. When adding the 3rd piece onto the strip set, try to mix up the colors and patterns. Make sure that you're spreading around all the different colors. Don't overthink this part too much either. You just want to pick up a strip and sew it onto your strip set. Sometimes I would add 2 smaller strips onto a longer strip set, and sometimes I would have a strip set that was all the same length as the piece I was adding on. Just pick up a strip and sew it on. The pattern was originally written to use 1 jelly roll and 2¼ yards of a white or low volume fabric. With those fabric requirements, it should turn out to be about 66 inches by 66 inches square. It's a great lap size quilt. If you're using jelly rolls and you want to make it bigger, just get 2 jelly rolls and twice as much of the background fabric. It could easily be around 80 by 85 or whatever size you want to end up with. When I saw the pattern, I knew it would be perfect for using leftover strips. Just mix up all the different colors and styles of fabric. I had a hard time deciding which colorway to make this quilt. I could see making the strip sets in all red and white and using blue as the background for a great patriotic quilt. Another possibility was making it in school colors for a graduate or making it in the colors of a favorite team. Another thought I had for this was doing all different colors for the strips and using black as the background. I think that would be a very striking quilt. Ultimately, I chose to do the pastel colors with a low volume white background so that I could use it for a baby quilt. Once all the sets have been put together, it's back to the ironing board to press. Press the last strip flat and then open it up to press away from the other two, or if you prefer, you can press the seam open. I had to use the Mary Ellen's Best Press spray on quite a few of my strips, especially the ones that had started out as binding strips. Once all the strip sets are pressed, it's time to cut the strip sets into squares. Now ideally, the strip sets should measure 6½ inches wide. Mine weren't quite that wide, more like 6¼ which is why I recommended a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I think that would have made my strip sets 6½ inches wide. So at this point, I recommend that you measure the width of a bunch of your different strip sets to see how wide they are. If they are 6½ inches wide, for the next part you will cut 6½ inch squares from your strip sets. If they're 6¼ inches, cut them 6¼ inches wide. Don't worry if they're not perfect. This pattern does have a little wiggle room to offset the difference. For the shorter strip sets, I trim off one side so that it's straight, and then I flip it over to cut my squares. I'm cutting all my squares at 6¼ inches wide because that's the width of my strip set. And of course, whatever is left over, I trim a section of it to 2½ inches wide if I can, because that's the size of the strip that I started with, or I cut it as wide as I can to get some scraps to use in another project. We wouldn't want to throw that fabric away. What will I make out of these scraps? I have no idea, but I am going to save them. Now, if you don't want to cut all of your strip sets individually, just one at a time, you could save some time by stacking some of the longer strip sets and cut multiple squares at one time. I would stack 3 or 4, sometimes 5 different layers onto each other, and I would use my 12½ inch ruler. First, I would make a 12½ inch cut once I've trimmed the one side, and then I would make the 6¼ inch cut, which was half of 12½. It worked out great for me. Just make sure that as you're layering the strip sets, they lay flat and are evenly spaced to spread out the seams to reduce bulk as you cut. A nice sharp rotary blade will help for this too. At the end of cutting all of my strip sets, I had a wonderful stack of 6 1/4 inch squares, a nice pile of 2.5 inch sets that were 2.5 inch wide, and a bunch of spare parts left over for future projects. Now we need to cut our background fabric. We're going to cut the squares to match the strip set squares. My strip set squares were only 6 1/4 inches wide, so I cut my squares 6 1/4 by 6 1/4. So these squares also need to be cut 6 1/4 inches by 6 1/4 inches. If your strip sets were 6.5 inches, you would want to cut your background squares 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches. The most important part is to make sure that whatever your strip sets are, your background fabric is cut the same way. I've got 1 1/3 yards of my background fabric, so I'm able to get 42 squares that are 6 1/4 inches by 6 1/4 inches, 6 cuts per 6 1/4 inch strip. You wouldn't have to have the background fabric be the same fabric throughout the whole quilt. You could have a variety of whites or whatever color you picked for your background color. I do recommend sticking to just one color for the background though. That way you can keep some consistency, otherwise it might get too busy and you would have nowhere for your eye to rest as you look at the quilt. Once all of your background squares are cut, you're going to want to draw a line from corner to corner with a pencil or a friction pen on the wrong side of the background square. Next, we need to layer the background squares with the strip set squares and pin them together. Take the time to set the strip squares up with their background pieces, half of them going vertical or up and down, and half of them going horizontally or left to right. That way you get some variety on the directions of the strips. The way the angle of the corner to corner line is, that will always be the same. Once all of them are pinned, you're ready to sew. You want to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance away from the center line on both sides of the line. This is some great mindless sewing. I love this kind of sewing. This is when I like to find a good book to listen to and just sew the afternoon away. I love using my Blade Saver thread cutter to cut all these things apart. It saves time and effort by going hand over hand. It's one of my favorite tools. We're going to cut all these apart and then we're going to flip it over and sew the line a 1/4 inch away from the center line again on the other side. Once they're all sewn and separated from each other, head to the cutting table to cut on the drawn line. You could use the scissors to cut these apart, but I found it easiest to use my rotary cutter and a small ruler. I found it easiest to cut, separate into left and right piles, and just keep the motion going. Once you're done cutting them apart, it'll be time to head to the ironing board to press. Press towards the background fabric. I will usually press 2 to 4 in a stack and then move the entire stack out of the way for the next stack. Once all the blocks have been pressed, it's time to trim each of the blocks. The pattern says to trim the blocks to 5.5 inches by 5.5 inches. I'm going to be using my 6.5-inch black lock ruler. There's a groove in the back side of the ruler to put right over the seam to help keep the blocks square and make sure there's no ruler wobble when you're cutting. I decided I was going to be trimming off too much if I trimmed the blocks down to 5.5 by 5.5. So I decided to trim mine to 5 3/4 by 5 3/4. It's not going to matter much on the pattern, so I can make my quilt top just a little bit bigger and save that 1/4 inch. Whatever size you pick to trim your blocks to, just make sure you trim them all the same. It's easiest if you trim 2 sides first, trimming off as little as possible, and then flip it around to do the other 2 sides. Once they're all trimmed, it's time to sew them into sets of 2 blocks. As I sew them into sets of 2, I am paying 0 attention to which blocks I'm sewing together. If that's hard for you, and you are too busy trying to figure out if you want to sew this color next to that color, just throw them in a bag that you can't see through, pull out 2 at a time, and sew them together. Just don't overthink it. You just want to make sure that as you're sewing all the sets of 2, you do them the same way every set of 2 that you send through the machine. I'm going to start by sewing 5 or 6 sets together and then look at a way to streamline and make it more efficient. So I've noticed that the block on the top, the background is kind of pointing towards the machine, and I'm always sewing it to the dark fabric. So I'm going to put my blocks on the left side, right side up, and I'm going to put my blocks on the right side of my machine, right side down. That way it's a little easier to pick them up. My visual clue that I'm sewing them correctly as I send them through the machine is that there's an arrow formed by the background fabrics where they are stacked on top of each other. As long as I can see this arrow, I know that I'm sewing them correctly, and I can just zoom through the pile of blocks to sew my sets of 2. We cut these apart, and then next we'll sew them into sets of 4. No need to press yet, we will press later. As I sew them into sets of 4, I can use that same visual clue to sew them together so that I know I'm sewing them correctly. And again, I'm not paying any attention to the colors and the fabrics as I'm sending them through the machine. I'm just picking up 2 and sewing them together. I ended up with 84 blocks. My quilt top will be 8 across and 10 down, all even numbers, so sets of 2 will definitely work, and then make them into sets of 4 and then sets of 8. If, for example, I had an odd number of blocks, say let's pretend my quilt would be 9 by 10, I would need to set aside 10 blocks at the beginning, put them where I don't see them, 1 for each row, to add on at the end to get my 9 across. I will end up with 1 set of 4 that will go unused, but I'll just put that in my bucket that I have of extra blocks and things left over from quilts that didn't get used. Cut apart these sets of 4, and then it's time to make the sets of 8. And make sure again, you just pick up 2 pieces and sew them together. have all of my rows put together. If my rows were going to have an odd number, this is where I would add that last block. I have 10 rows of 8 blocks. Right now, I am going to press just one of my rows. Now, if you wanted to, you could press all the rows at once. You would press half of them one direction, and the other half you would press the opposite direction, and then alternate the rows as you put them together. For me, it's easiest just to press one, and then I know that that particular row has the seams going that direction. And then as I add on each row to this row, I will put the seams going whatever direction is opposite of this. I like to press as I go. It just seems easier to me. Now that I've pressed the one row, I'm going to add a row to each side of this center row. Just keep adding on rows until you're out of rows, pressing after each row that you add on. When pressing, I will usually press first from the back side of the quilt top, and then I will open up the row so that I can press that seam all going in one direction. When all the rows have been added on, do one final pressing before you quilt. When you're all done with the pressing, you want to layer with your batting and backing and quilt as desired. This quilt is for a baby, so I want the backing to be extra soft and cozy, so I'm going to use a minky style fabric. My quilt top finished at 40 inches by 50 inches, so I can use 1 1/3 yards of a 60-inch wide minky for the backing. Because the front side is so soft and pastel, we decided to punch up the color a little bit for the backing, and we knew it was going to be a girl, so we put a brighter pink for the backing fabric. I loved this pink that had all the other colors in it. I quilted it on my long arm machine using a simple loop pattern in a variegated thread. I made my binding from all the pieces that were in the bin that were too short to add to the strip sets. Yes, it was a lot of piecing, but I think it's going to look really cool on the edge of the quilt, all the way around on the front and the back side. Plus, I got to use up all those little pieces of fabric that I didn't know what else I would do with them. I'm very happy with the way the binding turned out on this quilt. From the back side of the quilt, you can see the little pieces of fabric all the way around on the edge of the binding. And here is the finished quilt. I hope the baby will like it. I did have some leftover strip set squares, enough to make 2 more baby quilts or 1 large lap quilt. I've got them bagged together with the pattern ready to go. And the only strips I didn't use were the really bright and really gold yellow strips. I'm very happy with that decision. They would have really distracted from all the pretty pastels. And now it's time to do a strip bucket check-in. Last time we did a video, we were down to 5 buckets. And now we are down to 4 buckets. Woohoo! Progress! Yay! Watch for more videos in this series, and we will see you next month. We hope you remember to hit the like button, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!